Good morning, everybody. I'm going to try and talk to you about internet governance principles, which I think you've probably heard quite a lot about over various bits of time, hopefully in your studies before you were coming here. So principles are sort of things that we consider the right way to do things and the right way to behave, conducting ourselves. And so what do we think about the internet governance and how it should behave? How should it be conducted? What are the right ways of doing these things? So I should introduce myself, Adam Peake. I work for ICANN, the Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers, and I'm responsible for civil society and academic engagement with ICANN. So it's great to see you here. It's nice to be part of this school. I hope you all saw some email which gave a well, it was sent to all of you, so I hope you all saw the email, and it begins with the words Net Mundial, and it's got some, talks about things like the G7 and others. I hope you all saw that particular piece of email that came around, and we'll come to that later, but I hope you've read it. So the first thing I want to say is we'll begin with this particular slide. It talks about the Tao of the IETF, Tao being sort of a belief system for the IETF, which we've discussed a few times so far, the people who do the technical coordination of the internet. And this is a quote from a guy called Dave Clark. He's one of the sort of very original internet pioneers, and he's talking about one of the IETF's founding beliefs, which is we reject kings, presidents and voting, and we believe in rough consensus and running code. So we've had this idea of rough consensus, that we're all able to live with the decision, and the idea is that as a technical organization they want their code to run, and so this is a sort of basic belief. It's a basic principle of how the IETF is organized, and it's a basic principle really about internet governance as well. It means we don't have great leadership organizations and powerful leaders. It's about bottom-up coordination. It's about allowing people to get involved and participate. And that's really, I think, what this statement is trying to say to you. It's about an inclusive way of conducting policy development. So, and this is a very old quote. I think it goes back to probably the late 1980s. So it's a foundational sort of idea of what the internet is all about. Even though it's about technology, it's also one I think we can apply to how we should think about policy making on the internet. So, jumping away from that and go to the World Summit on the Information Society. You've heard this a few times, WSIS. And this occurred in, well, the first point we want to come back to, and Jeremy mentioned this yesterday, was the Environmental Summit, the Rio Earth Summit in 1992. And then there was also another summit that's relevant in 1995, the World Conference on Women. This was the Beijing Conference. The reason I want to mention these is these world summits are about establishing principles and norms. They're very high-level meetings where heads of state get together or the senior ministers get together and they establish a declaration or a statement. And we use those statements when we go back to our countries or to our regions, and we sort of take those notions and we may build them into our regulations, or we build them into the norms that begin to conduct society. So I think you'll see that a lot of the environmental regulation came from the Earth Summit in 1992. A lot of the gender legislation and ideas about gender equality came from the Beijing Summit in 1995. So the reason I want to mention this is because the World Summit on the Information Society started to do that for the internet in this global sense. It started to develop some principles around how the internet should be organized at a very high level. And there were things like, it introduced words like multi-stakeholder to us, or introduced them at this high level. So this was particularly important. These things start to set norms for us and permeate through. So the idea is that a summit of this kind, the ideas will permeate through into our sort of national organizations. So as I said, the two summits, Geneva in 2003 and Tunis in 2005, I'm hoping that you know some of the background to this, otherwise it may be a little bit of a rush, but it's in the background reading, I know, to the conference, to the school. So the Geneva Summit in 2003 gave us the notion of multi-stakeholder governance, and it also gave us two contrasting views of what the internet and excuse me, information society was about. One is this notion of bottom-up and distributed participatory internet model, and that's the sort of thing that Dave Clark was talking about with the Tower of the IETF. And then it also had the governments of the day talking about classic intergovernmental cooperation. So instead of involving all of us, it was the state-level interactions where traditionally policies internationally have been agreed. And this really came into conflict at this summit process, these two notions, one being the bottom-up model of the internet and the top-down model of multilateral organization. And this very much came into conflict at that time. The Tunis summit in 2005 started to try and resolve this, and it did so by, first of all, I suppose it created a space where we would have a dialogue to allow these conversations to continue after the summit, and that was the Internet Governance Forum. And I think you've all heard about that, and I think many of you have been to Internet Governance Forums. So this was a dialogue, this was a place for dialogue that would try and resolve the tensions between the Internet model and the intergovernmental sort of top-down model, a place for people to come together and discuss these issues. It also gave us this definition of Internet governance. And it's Internet governance is the development and application of, and I've deleted something here, Internet governance was the development and application of shared principles, norms, rules, decision-making procedures, and programs that shape the evolution and the use of the Internet. So that was June of 2005, and that is basically how we should consider what Internet governance is. And I think there's a couple of things to note here. First of all, that it's more than just being about ICANN. We've already said we don't want to always talk about ICANN here. But it meant that Internet governance was more than just discussing the domain name system and what ICANN was and this supposed control of the Internet by the United States. It's more than that. It was about the evolution and the use of the Internet. And that's important because we're talking both about technical policies that relate to technical matters, and also policies that relate to how the Internet is used and what we do on the Internet. And it's about these principles and norms and rules. So this is what we're thinking of when we think of Internet governance. Excuse me while I do that. So I think what we're really trying to look at here is that since 2005, the idea of norms and principles, what the World Summit in 2005 did was inspired people to start thinking about how they wanted the Internet to be considered, what was important in it to them. And since 2005, stakeholders have produced more than 25 statements and declarations. It's probably more than that now. 25 statements was measured by some groups in around 2014, I want to say. So we probably have more declarations and statements than that now of how they see that Internet governance should be approached and what the key aspects of Internet governance are. And there's about 80% commonality of issues. So if you look at those 25 statements, about 80% of the statements are pretty common throughout. And I'll run through a few examples of those. But they're generally supporting multi-stakeholder approaches and consensus-based processes. So what you're seeing is that post-WSIS, people were very much supporting multi-stakeholder models and multi-stakeholder approaches to Internet governance. It doesn't matter whether it was the OECD or just a group of civil society organizations and academics. These were common themes that were running through all of these sorts of statements. Some of the statements would focus on Internet architecture and how it operates, usually talking about openness and interconnectedness and a single one Internet. So we don't want the Internet to break up to avoid fragmentation. And others were talking about issues such as the importance of freedom of expression or privacy and issues of human rights online, particularly the notion that rights offline should be equivalent online. So what we have fought for and won in battles of human rights in the offline world should apply to the online world as well. And those are sorts of principles that you'll see permeating and commonly throughout these different declarations and statements. So just to pick out some examples, the OECD has got a set of statements, and it's a package of, I think, about 14 principles, and they have 3 key principles within this document. I think noting that openness is particularly important, flexibility in our approaches to making policy is important, and that the multi-stakeholder is important. So this is the OECD governments, the leading Western economies or the leading world's economies looking at these particular issues. The OECD talk about ensuring transparency and fair processes and accountability, and that's particularly important. Later on today, Pablo and I will talk a little bit about ICANN and the transformation that's happening there, and the work that's being done on transparency and accountability in ICANN is particularly important. It should be grounded in the respect for human rights. As I said, human rights, the rights that we have offline should be applied online. Respect for the rule of law, as you would expect from most things. Promote and enable cross-border delivery of services, and this is important. It's something that you will see in trade agreements that are ongoing. So if you read about things such as TPP, if you see that in a headline, these are the sorts of things we're talking about, where we're talking, people are talking about the cross-border delivery of services. Special role of governments in some policy areas. Jeremy alluded to this yesterday. They talk about openness and transparency and multi-stakeholder, except things like security and other issues where they still think that governments have a particularly special role. So these are sorts of things that the OECD think are important principles for internet governance. The Council of Europe, which is, I think, about 40 of the European nations. It's not the one that the British have just exited from. I think the United Kingdom is going to stay part of this particular group of Council of Europe. And they have 10 principles agreed by all of the member states. And you can see the listing of those general topics there. Human rights again, rule of law, multi-stakeholder governance, etc. Universality of the internet, meaning that everybody there should be the opportunity for access to all. Not that access will be guaranteed, but there should be the opportunity for access to all, and so on. So you can see these sorts of principles coming through. This is how they think the internet should be structured and how we should approach our policy making. Slightly different, excuse me, the Internet Governance Forum Dynamic Coalition on Internet Rights and Principles. So I've given 2 examples of sort of large, powerful intergovernmental organizations who've made principles. This is an example of a dynamic coalition. If you are part of the Internet Governance Forum, this is like a group of friends who get together and are interested in a topic. Slightly more formal than that, but we could form a dynamic coalition if we wanted to, or if we pick a subject. Might be a dynamic coalition on internet governance schools, and we would come together and then we forward the ideas on internet governance schools. There are many topics. There's a dynamic coalition on blockchain technologies. There's a dynamic coalition on all kinds of things. This dynamic coalition is on internet rights and principles, and it's an informal group of multi-stakeholders who come together, and their set of principles are also very similar. Universality, if I'm mispronouncing that, accessibility, neutrality, freedom of expression, the right to life, liberty and security, privacy and so on, privacy online. So these are the sorts of topics, commonality through a lot of them. And as I said, there's sort of 25 of them. I've broken out one here, which is human rights and social justice must form the legal and normative foundations on which the internet operates and governs, and it shall happen in a transparent and multi-stakeholder manner based on principles of openness, inclusiveness, participation and accountability. That's the kind of, when we have these simple bullets, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, etc., that's the kind of thing that people are expanding out when they're talking about what those particular principles should look like. So I think you get the general idea, quite high-level principles. The thing that happens here is that I suppose, let me try and think where I want to go. There's one more. It's I've lost what I'm trying to think about. I'm sorry. So when you have a single organization trying to create these high-level principles, It's not easy to do, but it's somewhat. You can come together and come up with these high-level principles. You don't necessarily have to implement them, and your goal is not implementation. There's an example here of something that is slightly different in that they were setting up a set of principles which they wanted to be able to operationalize and use in the work that they'd set for themselves. And this is an organization called CGI-BR, which is the Brazilian Internet Steering Committee. And the Brazilian Internet Steering Committee is a multi-stakeholder organization which was established by government decree, but it was established as a multi-stakeholder organization in the late 1990s, and it was established to be an advisor on sort of all things internet policy to the government. It also runs the CCTLD. So it has a formal role as the manager of the country code top-level domain name, .br, but it also provides advice to the government, or it provides advice which is not sought. There can just be an issue and it will provide advice, and it comes together to sort of help with the operation of the internet in Brazil. In 2007, they started to draft a set of guidelines that would help them as they went about their work. They wanted some guidelines that they could go back and refer to. If an issue came up, then they could say, well, we have these sets of principles. We can say our action is taking place based on principle number 5 and 6, or something like that. And the idea is that that would be helpful to their work. It would give them some transparency in the way that they operated. Well, it took this group, who'd already been in existence for about 10 years, it took them 2 years to come up with 10 principles. They held very, very regular meetings, but they insisted on complete agreement and compromise on what those principles would be. And I remember talking to people about this, and they started off with something like 7 principles, and then it jumped up to 15, and then dropped down to 12, and then to 10. And the reason for that is that you don't just have, the government is a member, but it doesn't have a particular super role. It's just an ordinary member of the committee. There are academics, there are activists, there are telecommunication companies, there are internet companies, and there's the media companies. So you're trying to find balances between these different organizations. And on some of those issues, for example, network neutrality, you have the activists on one side and you have the telcos on the other, and you have to find a balancing principle in the middle. That's why it took them 2 years to come up with this particular set of principles. So the point really is that it can be quite easy for one organization to come up with principles. The OECD is quite homogeneous, really, so they could come up with a set of principles that they could all agree on quite easily. It was more difficult for something like CGI-BR, the Brazilians, because they were such a diverse group. And yet they've been able to use those principles which they developed, and you can find them if you want by just, if you Google for CGI-BR principles for internet governance and the use of the internet, the title, and you'll find what the details of those principles are. But they've been able to use them in various cases. You might have heard recently that a Brazilian high court judge blocked the use of WhatsApp. One of the things that the Brazilian CGI group did was use the principles to argue against that blocking. But those principles were agreed by, general society, and it was helpful in using against this court case that had blocked WhatsApp use. There's also quite a famous piece of law in Brazil called Marco Civil, and it's the Internet Bill of Rights for Brazil. And this is a document that is passed by the government, and it has these various principles about openness, about right to privacy and so on, privacy online, and these are codified into law. It's also the law that is the basis for network neutrality law in Brazil. And this was very much based on some of the principles that came out of the work that we're talking about here by the Brazilian Internet Steering Committee. So they had principles that can then be reused. And this is the important thing. So we have 25 sets of principles or more, but how do we actually implement them is a particularly important aspect of all of this. It's all very well having principles, but you have to be able to use them. They have to have some future use in society. And what we're seeing here is that this very carefully constructed set of principles by the Brazilians, they can use. So this challenge of, they were talking about, if it's so difficult at the national level to build a set of agreed principles, imagine how difficult it will be for us to build a worldwide set of principles that would be agreed worldwide. I think you can extend that this is a challenge for us all to think about. If we want a global set of internet governance principles, then they're going to be very hard to construct. But constructible they are. I mean, it's something I think that could be done. This is the list of principles. They go into much more detail if you do search and find them. Privacy, democracy, universality, diversity, innovation, etc. You know, the neutrality of the network, as I said, if you can imagine that activists plus the telcos agreeing on that kind of language is going to be very difficult, but something they've managed to do. And then, again, as I said, if you want to go into the details of them, then they're all online, and they're worth looking at. Now, the other thing I want to talk about, and just jumping ahead here, is we mentioned Net Mundial a few times. And Net Mundial really is a Brazilian construct. It came out of Brazil and was held in Sao Paulo in 2014. And its role was really to create a set of principles that would be, if not the global principles that I mentioned would be very hard to construct, then at least a base document of principles that we could think about. So having heard Net Mundial mentioned a few times over the last day or so, I thought I'd give a quick introduction to what it is and its origins. And you'll see here that in June of 2013, you know that Snowden revealed a lot of information about the NSA's program of surveillance, mass surveillance. And I think in many ways this was the trigger for why Net Mundial occurred. Dilma Rousseff, who has unfortunately just been unseated as the president of Brazil, in September 2013, she made a very passionate speech to the United Nations General Assembly about the threat to the future of the internet that was a real threat to the internet, that the NSA's surveillance programs were basically creating. She felt that in the absence of a right to privacy, there can be no real freedom of expression and opinion. And she felt that this was undermining the possibilities of democracy. It was something that she was extremely passionate about. This was followed shortly after, and it was not followed for any deliberate reason. It just happened to be that the group of internet organizations, the people like Pablo's groups, the RIRs, ICANN, the Internet Society, which I know many of you are part of it, ISOC chapters. These organizations were coming together for a meeting in Montevideo, and the timing of it was very useful, coming just a couple of weeks after Rousseff's speech. And they released a statement, the Montevideo statement, which basically called on some important actions to be taken to prevent and restrict surveillance, and a call to protect many of the basic principles of the internet about ensuring openness well, basically to protect the internet and help it remain open. This was immediately followed by the then ICANN CEO going to Brazil and talking to Rousseff and saying that they needed a global meeting on internet governance at this time. It would be the right thing to do. So at the end of November of 2013, it was agreed that a conference called Net Mundial would be held the following April. So 5 months later, there would be a conference called Net Mundial. This is a view of how the Net Mundial was organized. There's a high-level committee which sort of provided political oversight, an executive multi-stakeholder committee which was basically the program committee and did all the drafting of documents and so on, and then some logistical work. All of these were multi-stakeholder. Stakeholders were able to appoint their own members to these committees, so it wasn't that somebody said, you and you will be joining this committee. The stakeholders in a bottom-up manner were able to appoint their own members to the committee. And there was then a call for contributions. We put out this long set of documents about sort of giving guidelines, that we wanted to have a document that was about principles and a document that was also about a roadmap for the future. There were example documents and then listing up all of these 25 principle documents. And then basically an open call for anybody who wanted to could then just put in a contribution. You put in what were your ideas about this particular set of subjects. And there was only about a month to do this. It was February of 2014. And there was something like, I think in the end, well, there were examples of them you can see here. I think this is, the Internet Society of Yemen put in a comment, and then there's a group of academics below. All of these are still online if you're interested. The idea was that people would put in something like 7 or 8 pages of writing on what they thought the principles were, or what they thought the issues were, or just a general statement of their concerns. And in the end, I'm trying to think how many comments there were. There were about 180 comments received from around the world, from many different organizations. And this is a basic breakdown of that. So, 186 contributions, and you can see that they were broken down by civil society and academia and so on. So it was quite a good return of substantive information, 186 very substantive comments in a very short period of time, including 20-odd governments, 22 governments. And all the continents were represented. It was a rushed process, but it was one that received quite a lot of comment. What then happened is one of the committees put together a draft document, a draft statement, coalescing and all the common themes that were in those documents, and you were then given the opportunity to comment on that draft. And the comment took place paragraph by paragraph. I don't know if you can see the detail there. Can we see the detail? Right, so there were 44 comments on the first introductory paragraph. I think the most comments that appeared was a couple of hundred on one particular paragraph. And then the drafting team got back together and carried on talking about what happened. And you can see here the idea is that on human rights there were these comments down the side, and it just went through and through and through. There was something like 1,360 comments in the end, and that took place in about 2 weeks. So again, you're seeing a way of, a bottom-up way of building comments on a set of principles. The initial document came out of global comment. That document was then put online for comment, and so on and so forth. So it was a way of building a document, and this is what the Net Mundial process was about. Then when you actually got to a meeting, because it was a physical meeting in the end, a 2-day meeting in Sao Paulo, and there were 4 microphones like this. Well, we've only got 2, so there were 4 of those, and one was for people from technical community and academia to stand up and talk at, and you can see, and government, technical, and you'll probably notice randomly that everybody at the microphone is from our region, and you'll probably notice some of them if you've been around meeting. Edmund Chung from .asia, I've forgotten her name, .korea, .kr, no, yeah, YJ Park, and the infamous and famous Mr. Aristey from Iran. Anyway, just randomly that they happen to be all from the Asia Pacific, but it's an example of how these 4 microphones were used for people to come in and give comment. There was effectively a 5th microphone, which was remote access. So instead of just having, so if you were online, you could send in a comment. There were, I think, something like 30 hubs around the world where people were sitting having parallel meetings. So there were another 1,000 people contributing. Drafting went on overnight. Yes, that's the nighttime drafting. The Brazilians gave free wine for the overnight drafting. I found that particularly difficult, and my ability to draft got quite poor. People from religions that don't drink had a great advantage, we found. Seriously, and then drafting continued in the morning, which was particularly painful. And then it continued during the day while the sessions were going on, and then there was still some online final drafting, because the idea of a high-level political committee, they basically said on one particular paragraph that would be in violation of most laws that we have, so it's probably not a good idea to put that in as a particular principle. And this is just an example of how the process worked. The document was then read into the committee, into the meeting. So it was read as a full document, which basically was a way of reading it into the record, and then it was adopted by acclamation. It's, an example of how do you, does that make a legitimate document? I mean, it's kind of a way of doing it. So you've got this idea of the Net Mundial document produces a set of principles. Well, the Net Mundial process produces a set of principles. It's done it in a bottom-up way. It's done it through open processes. There have been opportunities to comment. There have been opportunities to comment in the physical meeting, and then does that produce a legitimate document? Some people will say yes, and some will say no. And Russia, sorry, I've just dropped something. And Russia, for example, as the government decided it would not vote for this particular document, and it made a minority statement against it. And some civil society members turned their backs on the process of reading the document at the end because they disagreed with it. They felt that the section on surveillance should have been much stronger because they thought it was all about Edward Snowden. And that's fine, because that's what democracy and our rights are. If you don't agree with something, you don't have to support it. And Russia and some civil society organizations didn't. So what I'm trying to get to really is what's next. We have these documents. I think the Net Mundial process, for example, I think it was quite legitimate, but I wouldn't want to say that this is a superly endorsed, globally acceptable document. But what's happened since to the Net Mundial document is that it's been acknowledged by these different organizations, specifically BRICS, as you might expect, WSIS plus 10, which is a UN process in New York, the Takamatsu G7 declaration earlier this year, OECD declaration in Cancun. All of them have recognized the Net Mundial document as being something that's important and a document to reference to. And then the European Commission documents and other documents have actually referred to it. But at the same time, we also heard in the later part of 2014, just after Net Mundial, some UN processes, governments deliberately would not have Net Mundial mentioned in their documents. The Brazilian government asked for paragraphs to be included in some of these UN documents, and other governments refused to have it recognized, saying that it was not a legitimate UN process and therefore could not be included. So there's still, it's difficulties about, what I'm trying to say is that we have these notions and principles of internet governance or any sort of principle. They're very hard to turn into something that is more than just soft and advisory. We might agree with them, but how do we actually turn them into something that is useful either in law or regulation? I think there's value in the Net Mundial outcomes. I think it showed basically that multi-stakeholder processes can work on a global level and can produce something that is valuable and acceptable. There's many more words on that slide than just there. So this is where I want you to try and remember that piece of paper, which I do not have in front of me. Excuse me a second. Sorry about this. I don't know, is there any... you're brilliant. Thank you. Right, so I hope you saw the email. It began with examples of principles. Language in each statement evolves from one prose to another, and from soft discussion at Net Mundial to negotiated statements. I hope you saw the email. So what we're trying to say is that in Net Mundial in 2014, there was one paragraph which spoke about unified and unfragmented space. And it said that the internet should continue to be globally coherent, interconnected, stable, unfragmented, scalable, and accessible network of networks based on a common set of unique identifiers that allows data packets, information to flow freely end-to-end regardless of lawful content. And that's a real squeezing together of many different ideas and principles. And it's a really soft statement. You can't really say that that's particularly actionable. But if you go down to the Trans-Pacific Partnership, TPP, and this is from a version of February 2016, I'm not sure if it's the final one, you can start to see this sort of ideas of an unfragmented space, of scalable networks that are not fragmented and they're interconnected, being turned into language by trade negotiators. And a trade negotiated treaty, this is going to become, potentially, this would become a treaty. And then in the G7 meeting in Japan in April, we see another version of what this particular language looked like. We continue to support ICT policies that preserve the global nature of the internet, promote the flow of information across borders, and allow internet users to access online information, knowledge, and services of their choice, etc., etc. And if you go across the page, then you get the OECD declaration, which again talks about we support the free flow of information that reinforces the internet's openness and in particular its distributed and interconnected nature while respecting applicable frameworks for privacy and data protection, strengthening digital security. OECD added a little bit of a twist with the security part there. But it's a similar document, Net Mundial, soft document, bottom-up process, blah, blah. Something more formal in TPP, something more formal in the OECD, something more formal with the G7. Was it last week? No, September 2016, we have in China, the G20, a softening of this because the G7 ministers and the OECD ministers, those are the sort of the big economies. They're all you know, pretty much similar in their points of view. You have a slightly more diverse audience in the G20 in China, and they soften this a little bit, and they're talking about, again, though it's the global nature of the preserve the global nature of the internet, promote the free flow of information across borders. And it doesn't matter that TPP probably won't be endorsed. You may have read that Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump, neither of them will run it forward. The Republicans in the Senate won't do. Europe seems to be rejecting it now. It doesn't particularly matter that TPP won't go forward. Once negotiators get their hands on language, they tend to reuse them. It's agreed language. They've spent a lot of time thinking about this. So it will be reused in future statements. And so this notion of open internet from Net Mundial, I think we can see is being taken into language which is more formal. So that's how these different principles can sort of evolve, I think. So that's a sort of, well, the basic message is how do we take these principles and turn them into something more concrete and something that we can use them in our daily lives. If we do believe in a lot of these principles, how can we make them part of our national norms? So from principles to things that, from something that is a belief system to something that becomes a sort of standard operating process. And that's what I'm trying to show in this example. And I have to say that a lot of it actually belongs to ideas from a friend and a colleague called William Drake, who's at the University of Zurich. So if the ideas are good, it's Bill's idea, and if it's bad, then I'll take responsibility. But it's, I think it's an interesting notion to try and track how something comes from a soft statement and into, you know, things where our heads of state are actually trying to agree upon them. And that's really what I'm trying to say here. So if you have any thoughts on that question, that's the basic question I want to hear about. How can we apply these principles that have been developed and discussed, the process we consider internet governance, how can we turn them into something stronger than just principles that we talk about? And with that, I've finished, which is, I think, 15 minutes early. So you're going to have lots of comments and ideas and questions, I hope. Thank you.